And I'm delighted to have as our two guests, Andreas Bernhard, guest scientist at the Institute of Culture and Aesthetics of Digital Media at Leuphana University, and Stephen Nichols, author of The Evolution of Elevators, Physical Human Interface, Digital Interaction, and Megatall Buildings. They have longer and distinguished CVs, which I am going to tragically cut short, but they are distinguished. They also have a distinguished publication record, which I believe their books will appear in either your chat or your Q&A buttons below, with links to Amazon, which I urge you to take advantage of as soon as possible. Now, chat and Q&A buttons. We're first going to be having 12 to 14 minutes each, we can go a little long, from our two speakers, good conversational introduction to the topic. Then we have the Q&A. I moderate, and ideally by passing along your questions, which you should put into the chat or the Q&A buttons below. Then I can read from them, the panelists can read from them, they can talk to one another. But the point is, the more questions you put in, the more of a wonderful conversation we have. When I do choose them, I do them in any order, simply for whatever seems like would make a good conversation. Do not worry if your question does not get answered. Send email to me afterwards, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org, and I'll be delighted to forward your questions to our panelists so that they can have the option to respond to you. Now, the other great worry, you might have to leave halfway through to go pick up, groceries from the store or something. Don't worry. This is going to be not only streamed live, but available within 24 hours on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. So you can leave, you can still get a chance to read it again. You can get a chance to tell your friends about it. It'll be fun. So having said all that, I'm going to ask Dr. Bernhard, would you be so kind as to speak first?
Certainly. Thank you, David, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I want to speak for 12 to 15 minutes now about the elevator from a more historical point. I wrote a book about the cultural history of the elevator, which is also translated to English. And I want to focus in my short talk about the elevator and its constitutive role in the reorganization of the multi-story building from the mid-19th century on. As you maybe know, the first elevators were built in the 1850s in New York City and later in Chicago. And important for my research has been that the elevator is not just a mere technical means of help to be integrated in already existing buildings, like the tenement house, the office, or the hotel, but on the contrary, the elevator is rather responsible for fundamental change in the perception, in the organization, and in the imagination of multi-story buildings. And this transformation process between approximately 1860 and 1930 in the US, and with a slight delay in Europe, is the topic of my short talk now. And I want to briefly describe the role of the elevator in terms of 4 keywords. And the 4 keywords are breaches, hierarchies, controls, and interiors. And I want to start with the keyword breach. As you all know, the elevator, you could say, reorganize the vertical, and especially the shaft cuts a vertical swath, you could say, straight through the building. To the contrary, if you remember multi-story buildings built before the elevator in Paris or other big European cities, from novels or paintings, you may think about it that the layout characteristics. But these old multi-story buildings were focused and were concentrated in immediate floors, secondary staircases, corridors with dead ends. So before the elevator, there was no clear architectural concept of the floor. It didn't exist until the 1860s, 1870s. And then the elevator around the 1860s enables the construction of something like a real vertical straight building. It domesticates, you could say, the previously amorphous floor plan. So you all had this experience when you were in an elevator. If you stand in the cabin and you look at the push buttons, there's the first floor, the second floor, the third floor, the fourth floor, and everything in between does not exist. And I think that's very important, because you could say the elevator, historically speaking, is an element of the practice of preaching in the modern architecture of the 19th century. So you all know horizontal breaches like the channel or the avenue, or the straight streets. Maybe some of you know Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher, who talked about the Haussmannization of Paris. You know, Haussmann in Paris, who transformed Paris to a system of broad avenues. And I would call the elevator vertical Haussmannization, because it puts the breach vertically through the building. And I would consider that something like a disciplinary element in the history of architecture, because the elevator fragmented the multi-story building and transformed it from a whole. If you remember, maybe some of you read novels by Émile Zola. They often play in multi-story houses previous to the elevator, and there the house is a whole. You know, people chat from one floor to the other. The stairwell is like an amplifier of vertical communication, and the elevator transforms the multi-story building in a series of separate platforms. And I think that's very important for the imagination of the multi-story building, because this discontinuous stopping points of the elevator, its limitations of accessible space, makes each level of the house, each vertical level, as a discrete unit. And in the terms of media studies, which I come from, you could maybe call this transition from the stairwell to the elevator in the late 19th century, a transition from the analog to the digital. So I think the shape of the house undergoes a really fundamental change in this respect. My second point, which was the most important research in my book then, I called hierarchies. And as you immediately know, the elevator, of course, has an important impact on the vertical hierarchy of multi-story buildings. You could say it recoded the traditional hierarchies of living and working spaces. So if you think about the codes of upper floors until the late 19th century, some examples come to mind immediately. For example, the hierarchy of rooms in grand hotels. You know, before the elevator evolved, the higher you went in hotels, the cheaper and worse the rooms got. And the elevator really turns the system upside down. And in between 20 or 30 years, the most expensive rooms switch from the belle etage, the second floor, to the highest floor, to the penthouses. So you can say the elevator brings the epoch of the belle etage to an end and starts the era of the penthouse. generally, if you think about the traditional codes of upper floor living in the 19th century, then the traditional attic room has always been a space of poverty, of isolation, of poor and freaky people living there. Maybe some of you know this very famous German painting, The Poor Poet, by Karl Spitzweg, which shows an isolated poor poet in an attic with an umbrella because it rains in. And it's interesting if you study the history of early tenement buildings in Europe, and then the hygiene movement in the 1860s, 1780s, they developed what you could call a pathology of upper stories, and they tried to forbid buildings higher than 4 floors to be built, and they were successful. So if you go to Paris and you see very high old buildings, you always know they are built before the 1880s, because then only 4 floors were allowed. And of course, you immediately know that the elevator changed everything then, because after it's evolving in the 1860s, 70s, very fast, 3 new types of space evolved. The penthouse I already mentioned, the roof garden, and the executive floor. And you realize that the semantics of the upper floor, because of the elevator, very, very consequently switch from inaccessibility and illegitimacy to transparency, representation, power. So you could say around 1900, the so-called social pyramid, because of the elevator, finds its genuine architectural representation. Because now, because of the elevator, also the people on the top of the buildings are the richest and the most powerful. And today, I would say, or since the late 20th century, this alliance of total power and total gaze from the top seems like a natural ahistorical constellation. And you certainly remember the movie Pretty Woman, where Richard Gere lives in a penthouse in the Beverly Hills Hotel, although he has fear of heights, because as he said, I haven't found a penthouse on first floor. So this alliance seems natural, but it's an effect of the elevator. Third keyword, controls. I did research in this book about the shift from the elevator operator to the automatic push button controls, which is a very, very important threshold in the history of the elevator. Surprisingly to me was that the attendance authority in the early days was really something in terms of a professional career. So there were comprehensive exams if you wanted to be an elevator boy. There were real textbooks and everything, because the cable-based or lever-based or hand-cranked controls of the early days really demanded skills. So you had to autonomously accelerate and decelerate the speed of the cabin as a lift boy. And some of you maybe know the famous novel Felix Groll by German writer Thomas Mann, where an imposter tries to organize successfully his career as a lift boy in a Paris Grand Hotel, because he's such a skillful lift boy that everybody loves him, and women give him money and all that. So the elevator operator was a authoritative profession. And then the push button, introduced in the US in 1893 and Europe in 1903, immediately brought the elevator operator to an end and made it obsolete. So today, as you know, in fancy shopping malls or so, the elevator is only there, elevator boy is only there for representational reasons. So the push button, you could say, was responsible for the cultural assimilation of the elevator, because from the 20th century on, every child could operate it. Before that, sometimes in European cities, in Vienna or Paris, you still see these old plaquettes on old elevators where they say, children under 14 years are not allowed. And after the establishment of the push button, everybody could very easily operate the elevator themselves. But on the other hand, it kind of created a fear, which is very interesting because like the transition from the cable-based to the push button-based elevators, you could say transforms the creating of a movement through the cable to the mere triggering of the movement through the button. So you could say the push button cuts off the relationship between the origin and the effect of movement. And I would say this cut off, with this cut off, like the imagination of the dangerous elevator began, which we all know from horror movies and cinema. You know, there are half dozens of movies where an elevator kind of gets crazy and is uncontrollable and starts to murder its passengers. And I would say this imagination of the autonomous dangerous elevator is, historically speaking, only possible since the invention of the push button. Last keyword, interiors. I did research on the interior space of the elevator cabin, which from the start on in the 1860s, and I would say until today, if you think about elevator phobia and all that, which in a very irritating manner was on the crossroads in urban modernity between the greatest possible intimacy in the elevator and the greatest possible anonymity. So you ride an elevator in a very, very tight space with people which you often don't know and which come very close. And I think that's one of the crucial dispositions of the elevator. And from the start on, it was unclear of the elevator if the elevator is a public or a private sphere. So the elevator cabin was you could say, a foreign body in the multi-story buildings, and it produced many deadlocks. For example, in the late 19th century, there was a big discussion if men should take their hats off, like in other rooms, or leave their hats on, like in other means of transportation. This was a big discussion. Another thing was, for us today, unimaginably, that the elevators only run between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. And in the afternoons and the evenings and the nights, they were turned off. And there are great quotations in the late 19th century about businessmen in the 70th, on the 70th floor in Manhattan, where they leave the office at 5:01 p.m. and they have to climb down 70 floors by stairs. Then there was also a deadlock diseases like elevator sickness around 1900, where doctors said that the abrupt movements of the elevator overtax the nervous system. So this is also a sign of the elevator as a foreign body in the houses. Then in the early 20th century, the elevator cabin was taken for granted more and more, but it still affected the distribution of occupants and their social order. And I want to close my short talk with one or two examples about this new social order, because there is something you could call the politics of the elevator. So the vehicle, you could say, conveys not only passengers, but conveys also a particular image of humanity itself. And this image of humanity, I would say, is a strictly democratic and egalitarian one, because, for example, all concept of a servant's elevator in the early 20th century, which should have replaced the very well-established concept of the servant's stairwell in Europe, never took off. So there was a kind of a resistance of the elevator towards the separation of class. The elevator, you could say, is an egalitarian means of transportation, and this hypothesis maybe it gains strength if you bear in mind that there are many, and this was surprising for me in my research, that there are very many documents in the late era of European monarchy at the beginning of 20th century, that the European monarchs in Austria, in Russia, in Great Britain, they had fear from riding the elevator. For example, in 1913, when the Russian Tsar was invited to the wedding of King Wilhelm's daughter in Berlin, there were 300 people located in the Hotel Adlon, the biggest Grand Hotel, and then the whole guests had to be replaced because the Tsar didn't want to ride the elevator, because it threatened the traditional ceremonial order of the monarch. And there are great documents about that, also of other monarchs, that the spatial representation of monarchy through staircases, for example, it demanded space, you know, and the dark, narrow spot of the elevator interrupted the necessary continuum of visibility and representation of monarchy. So you could say, and this is my last sentence of the talk, that maybe the elevator had a small effect on the demise of European monarchy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will now shift to our second speaker, Mr. Nichols. May I ask you to go next?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Professor Bernard. It's interesting listening to Professor Bernard because my perspective is very different than his. I'm trained as an engineer, and I'm someone who's does not approach this as a historian, but someone who's worked in the elevator industry for many, many years. I spent more than 15 years at the Otis Elevator Company in various research and development roles. And then in 2021, I became a senior product manager at the Schindler Elevator Corporation. So before I begin, I should actually, I've been asked from some of the compliance folks to just read a short statement that the opinions and views that I'm sharing here today are solely mine, and they do not reflect the opinions and views of Schindler Group. But I think as I move forward, it's interesting to hear Professor Bernard's relation to how elevator technology and elevators interweaves with culture and people. As a systems engineer, I actually kind of decompose elevators and elevator technology into 4 points, but there are very different 4 points than what Professor Bernard mentioned. So to me, the fundamental job to be done of an elevator, the problem that the technology is trying to solve, is how do we transport cargo and passengers safely and quickly from one altitude to another. In order to solve that physics problem, if you will, there's really kind of 4 aspects that we need to look at: the fight against gravity, controlling friction, the interface with the rest of the building, and how you manage power and communication. And the technological advantages or advances in each of those 4 things kind of flow along kind of how the history is traced, but there's an additional problem that we can't neglect. In addition to those physics problems and that functional job to be done, there's an emotional and people aspect of a job to be done. How do we do that function of moving people in a way that delights them, in a way that makes it safe for them to move? And how does that get all interweaved into both what's happening in the building as well as what's happening in the city? Because I think one of the things that's interesting about elevators is they don't exist on their own. They're a system within a system. So if you look at the history of each of those 4 physics problems, there's an interplay when they go back and forth. So all of the great innovations and all of the great things that I've seen kind of offered into the world in this matter usually follow a hierarchy of they're done with people first, and then business and technology considerations come after that. So if you look at the people, that elevators had existed for decades, if not hundreds of years. You can trace the concept of throwing a hemp rope or a piece of plant over a tree branch back to the Babylonians and the Egyptians. We talk about the elevator history or the elevator industry getting started in the 1850s and 1860s, not because the elevator was brand new, but because the elevator was becoming safe. There's examples of elevators and lifting chairs or other technologies that existed even in the 1820s and 1830s, where hemp ropes and other things were used to lift people in the building, but it was unsafe and people were worried about whether they would survive the trip or even their cargo would survive the trip. So the first kind of innovation, if you will, that leads to some of the development of the elevator history is a co-innovation around safety and the elevator safety brake, as well as the propulsion. So remember in the 1850s, we're talking about prior to electricity, prior to the invention of the light bulb. Most of the elevator propulsion at the very beginning was either steam power or some form of hydraulic propulsion, hydraulic pistons, or some sort of water balance system. And to lift the cargo up in the building, you had to kind of provide some counterweight and some physics to bring things against gravity and bring them up or pull them. Most modern elevators now are traction systems where you have a steel rope or a flat belt that goes over a pulley. So in order to do that, it's both kind of the fight against gravity and how do you control friction so that you can stop safely and start. So Elisha Otis's invention in 1852, which was then demonstrated at the World's Fair in the Crystal Palace in 1854, and then patented later in 1861, is really not an invention of an elevator, but an elevator safety brake. So that original invention allows for elevators first to be used in factories. Elisha was originally working in a furniture factory, and some of his first installations were in factories moving cargo. And then after that, slowly they start to get adopted in buildings that are in public use, first in hotels and shops, and eventually in residences and office buildings. So Professor Bernard touched on it, but it's important to go back to the elevator of the 1850s, 60s, and 70s is not the elevator that we think of it now. There was a rope that was the method of control where the elevator operator would pull on it and signal to the controls to kind of go up or down. There often were benches in the elevator. You would sit in the elevator as the jerking motion, really based on the skill of the operator, may or may not be pleasant to the riders. So the first elevator for public use that's often cited is in 1857 with the E.V. Howitt department store. Later, you get the Fifth Avenue Hotel with an Otis Tufts passenger elevator in kind of those early shops. And in each of those cases, you have the operator that's tugging on a rope, and it's a completely mechanical system. So it takes a little bit of time with other inventions for the elevator to start to evolve out of that early, almost rickety system into something that starts to look like we're more used to now. You get a couple different innovations that come from other industries. In 1879, you get Edison's light bulb, and you get in the 1870s and the 1880s, you get dual development, both in Europe and the US, of electricity and electrical distribution. So Werner von Siemens in 1880 is really the first example of an electric elevator. In the United States, the Otis Brothers company worked with Eckmeyer and what became General Electric on an electric elevator. So in the 1880s and later in the 1890s, you have a transition from hydraulic and steam powered elevators into electric elevators. It's only when you look at kind of that combination of electricity as a propulsion means do you start to get other benefits for control. So for example, the push button that Professor Bernard mentioned, we have early examples of that around 1900 as electricity and electric signal control starts to become, but in some ways it doesn't catch on until later. So around the turn of the century, you're transitioning from kind of birdcage style, very ornate elevators, potentially with those benches, into something that is starting to have potentially some control, and more control. You get micro leveling. So for example, now we don't think, or most people don't, or take it for granted that elevators stop at the floor that you request. Micro leveling and the ability for the elevator to detect when it was at the floor and provide some feedback to the operator, maybe no longer through a rope, but through a lever, starts around the turn of the century. In addition, you start, independent of the elevator propulsion, you start to have some of the developments into how the elevator better interfaces with the building. We don't think about it as an interface necessarily, but elevator doors now provide a critical safety interface between the elevator cab and the rest of the building. But elevator doors really didn't exist at the beginning. It was really a moving platform, moving up and down in the middle of a shaft. And you have inventions by several different people, contributions from Alexander Miles, in automatic doors early in the 1870s, 1880s. You have Floor, a company in Germany, suggesting how to lock doors together so that when the elevator is not at the floor, the elevator doors become locked. But you have kind of parallel innovation of many different ideas that really don't start to become meaningful to people until much later. The other thing that's important to remember that's happening in that 20 years before the turn of the century and the 20 years after is you get a parallel innovation in architectural history and other technologies. Many of the buildings, both in Europe and the US, were either wood or masonry, and there was a limit to how high they could go. So the limit to a masonry building with maybe a hydraulic elevator was somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 stories. It's only until you start to have steel construction that buildings really start to take off. So it's really the co-development of the elevator with steel construction that we start to have skyscrapers. Steel construction was really spurred on after the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. So you get the first steel construction building. The home insurance building in Chicago is completed in 1884. In some ways, it's considered the first skyscraper because it's supported by that exoskeleton of steel. It had 10 stories and was originally 138 feet, and then it was extended in 1890 to about 180 feet, which doesn't sound like a lot now, but was towered over some of the buildings around it. When you had the parallel development of steel construction, as well as the propulsion technology and the electric elevators, that by 1910 and 1920, you have electric motors, you have buildings that are reaching higher and higher, and by 1931, you have the Empire State Building. So the Empire State Building is, in 1931, certainly a steel construction, electric elevator that runs from the top to bottom, but you still have an elevator operator. You still have a control system behind that is somewhat primitive today. If you fast forward, you really don't get microelectronics and the computer that you think of being the brains behind an elevator until the mid 1970s. But the elevator experience in the Empire State Building is starting to be different than what you had seen previously. You walk up, you tell an elevator operator where you want to go. That elevator operator is essentially controlling the operator up and down, and then you kind of go to where you're going. It's the push button that Professor Bernard mentioned is what starts to change the passenger experience, but I would suggest that it's the combination of the push button and the automatic door, which come in the early 1950s, that really provide a very equitable ride and set up the paradigm of the passenger experience that we see now, where now you walk up, anyone can walk up, press the button, the door is open, you get on, you tell the elevator where you want to go, and you're on your way. So that combination of how do I do it safely, how do I take advantage of other innovations in other areas, but whether it's architecture, whether it's the development of electric motors, push buttons in other industries, that combination by many different innovators bringing it together is really what kind of spurs along kind of that development of the elevator as a system, and then the elevator as a technology that enables some of those cultural changes that you mentioned. So Professor Bernard mentioned kind of the flipping of the bottom floors from being kind of the most expensive or the most sought after to the penthouse and the creation of a penthouse. But there's also other things that we take for granted, like an elevator lobby, and the notion of elevators working together to serve the building traffic is something that kind of co-developed both as the architecture evolved, as well as the ability for the elevator technology to innovate and enable that. So with that, there's lots of little details and stories I suspect that we can tell, and I hope that there will be some questions that will lead us to this, because I think one of the things that many of us who've worked with elevators or studied it in the past is it seems like a box on a rope, but it's a lot more complicated and a lot more fascinating than a box on a rope, and kind of looking at that interplay between people and technology and the culture is very interesting.
Thank you so much. Thank you both so much. I am going to go now to the questions. And the first one is from, and by the way, and I encourage everyone, put in more questions. Okan Uslu asks, I have a question for Mr. Nichols. As traditional rope elevators can only reach approximately 1,640 feet, or about 151 stories, in which means passengers have to take multiple elevators to get to the top of the building, would you think of a ropeless and multi-directional elevator system, which could perhaps change the perception of buildings and their design?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Let me fill in some of the details for people who may not have thought about this problem. So there's an interesting line at which you cross when you look at the physics of an elevator, that as buildings get taller and taller, the weight that an elevator must support and must carry at some point becomes to comes to be dominated not by the amount of the passenger or the cargo getting on and off the elevator cab, but by the weight of the system itself. And there's a limit at which steel rope can no longer support its own weight. So the strength to weight ratio of any suspension member has a physical limit. So from a historical perspective, this is one of the reasons why the industry switched from hemp rope to steel cable, and why when you look at the development of steel cable has been pushed and pulled both by, sorry for the bad elevator pun, pushed and pulled by both the suspension bridge industry as well as the elevator industry and others. But I think it's an interesting question, is that as that technical limit moves forward, as we look at stronger and stronger strength materials, whether it's high strength steel cable, whether it's carbon fiber ropes, whether it's ropeless, that will change both the elevator technology and the building design. I might suggest that it's a combination of both the elevator technology and the architect's questions. Certainly there are buildings that are very, very tall and narrow. Those buildings offer a different perspective, both from the technology and the culture, as ones that are kind of shorter and squatter, if you will. There's a notion in architecture of kind of the 15-minute city, and kind of having all of the places to work, live, and play in a short amount of time. I think that concept translates well to elevators and building design as well, because in many cases you don't want to be in the elevator the whole time. You want to be able to kind of get where you're going quickly, and have all of the amenities in the building. That I think Professor Bernard might have some comments on. While the penthouse is a sought after place to go in the building, there's some disadvantages to the penthouse as well, because it takes a long time to get there. From an energy perspective, you need to transport all of the water and the food and the fine amenities even higher.
Do you want to speak to that, Professor Barnard?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Nicholas. I think your answers were absolutely great, and I think I could not add something very substantial. But it's an interesting thought you mentioned just in the end, that maybe the career of the penthouse after, let's say, approximately 100 years could be maybe in danger from an ecological sense, because I would say from the start of the penthouse, from the early penthouses in the 1920s, I would say, in New York City until now, there haven't been any disadvantages of the penthouse publicly mentioned. But maybe as you said just before, from a rather new ecological perspective, maybe the lower floors they will gain against some attractivity in terms of ecological and energy reasons. But this would be a really very new tendency. I haven't heard about it, but it's a very interesting thought.
Yeah, it is an interesting thought, and as you were speaking, I was reminded there's another potential parallel that we'll look at, or from more recent history, is at some point there was the development of a sky lobby concept. So as many of you may know, in very tall buildings, you don't go from the entry point to the final destination in one elevator ride. For the reasons of elevator dispatching and balancing the traffic of all of the flow, many times you enter, you go to a midpoint or a sky lobby, and then you transfer to another elevator, and then you keep going. So that notion kind of originally started to save space in the building. So certainly as buildings get taller and taller, and you need to move more and more people, you can add more and more elevators, but oftentimes architects want the space in the building for other reasons. The sky lobby concept allows you to use fewer elevators and have kind of this similar overall throughput, but it provides for an architectural feature that wasn't there before. And there are some buildings that use those sky lobbies or use sort of intermediary lobbies in the different points of the building to provide kind of a community setting and some other amenities that you may not have if you were just going in one shot.
I'm going to intrude now with a question of my own. Oh, I see a question showed up. I'm going to ask it anyway. I want to talk about the emergence of the fragility of the elevator, both as a mechanical question and a cultural question. Mechanically, I'd like to ask Mr. Bernard about the emergence of elevator repair, elevator mechanics, and the change of elevator engineering to account for its breakdowns. And I'd like to ask, sorry, that was for Mr. Nichols, for Dr. Bernard, the emergence of the image of the dangerously fragile elevator. And I'm thinking in this case of something like a novel by like High Rise by J.G. Ballard, where how should I put it, society breaks down when the elevator breaks down. So in fact, I'm asking about elevator fragility, both in terms of the mechanics, the history, the the personnel, and then also the cultural image for both of you.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and elevator, the elevator industry and the elevator product is one where both the installation of the equipment and the service, maintenance, and repair has been essentially part of the elevator industry from the beginning. One of the things that's interesting is, so we touched on Elijah's invention. One of the sad parts of the history, at least of Elisha Otis, is that he passes away very early after the invention. So his invention is in 1852, and then it's patented, and then he passes away in 1861. It's really his sons, Charles and Norton Otis, who build what becomes the Otis Elevator Company, and in some ways pioneer some of what you're talking about. It's under the Otis brothers' leadership that they offer something that was potentially unique and novel at the time, of a service and a maintenance contract. Of not only will I install the elevator, but I will then continue to look after it for some time and repair it. So that notion of so from an engineering perspective, it would have been a fascinating time to live, because every elevator was different, every technology was different, and everything was rapidly evolving. But from a maintenance perspective, it must have been a mess, because you had different systems in this building and different systems there. And the notion of an expert, with someone you call, kind of evolves at the same time. So I think there's an interesting parallel development of the technology that's being installed, the notion of having a service, or the development of a service industry, if you will, and then kind of, as you kind of get into the early 1900s, first in Europe, and then in 1921, I believe, you get the first elevator codes. So I think safety has always been at the core of the industry, both in kind of the demonstration and the development of the safety brake, as well as in response to accidents and different things that have happened. So the notion of needing to have a safe elevator and needing to have kind of expert repair, as well as rules and regulations. I think the elevator is one of the first technologies that had a code around it, where that was there, and that's still core to the industry now, where you're developing safety regulations, and everyone in the industry is participating to help make the riding public safer.
Thank you.
Yes, it's a great question, David, and I think that Stephen has already touched on most of the important points. I could maybe add that also from a historical perspective is absolutely true what Stephen just said, because there is interestingly a great reluctance in Europe, especially in France, in terms of the invention of the elevator in mid-19th century, because of the accidents in mining. You know, in 18th century there were very archaic elevator-like platforms going down into the earth, not up, in mining, and there have been some fatal accidents in German mines and French mines, and these accidents, they put towards vertical transportation into the earth, put the notion of fragility, which you mentioned, David. And as far as I know, maybe Stephen, you can confirm it. As far as I know, in France, there have been until basically until the invention of the electric elevators in the 1890s, there have been mainly hydraulic elevators with pistons directly into the earth because of this fear, because there was something like a mistrust on the rope. So I would say this question is really well put, because fear of accidents and the fragility of elevators has been the main concern in the early history, and it's no wonder, you know, it's kind of consequent that the big famous caesura in the early history of the elevator we have talked about a lot already this evening or this afternoon in New York, is that the event which is considered as the invention of the elevator, Elisha Otis's presentation in 1854, deals, as Stephen has said, not with the elevator as a new invention, but with a safety device. So yeah, I think that's really a very important point.
I'll answer your question, Professor Bernard. I don't know specifically about France and your point about the hole for the hydraulic cylinder, but I will point. I know that in England, the development of the elevator was slowed in those early years, in part because the notion of putting a steam engine in the building that required its own maintenance and its own power, and somebody feeding coal into the steam engine was thought to be unsafe. So it's only later, when you have hydraulic elevators and then later electric elevators, that they started to be more accepted in certain places in Europe. So it's not just the safety of the passengers riding the elevator, but the overall safety in the building. I mean, that continues to today. So I mean, two things that come to mind is so that the use of elevators during evacuation situations and the evolution of how you can use the elevator as a safety device, both during the construction and the use of the elevator, that persists today. And interestingly enough, to your point about France, even to this day, the regulations in France require more maintenance and more watching, so to speak, of the elevator than many other places, even in the rest of Europe.
I have a quick question. Is the most technologically impressive elevator then in the Johannesburg gold mines?
Well, so what defines technologically impressive is a matter of taste in a way. So I mean, sort of mining elevators are unique in the sense that that they don't have to necessarily conform to the passenger elevator code, and you can do some different things. And certainly, if you look at the development of mining technology, it parallels and in some ways diverges from elevator technology. But to me, there's actually a very interesting cultural question about what is impressive when it comes to an elevator. My favorite example of this is that if you go to an American city like New York, most people will feel that they want the rush of the elevator and they want to feel the acceleration rate under their feet after the doors close and they're going. But if you were to go to Japan, the definition of an impressive elevator is very different. In Japan, you walk into the space, the doors close, a moment later, the doors open and you're at your destination. And you may not have felt anything at all. So, and that from a technology perspective is kind of controlled by the acceleration rate. But it answers or it asks kind of several important questions. What is an impressive elevator ride? And also one of the most challenging questions I've ever been asked, and maybe Professor Bernard has a better answer than I once gave, is an elevator a place or is it a space in between places? Because how many people perceive and experience elevators is that few seconds in between where they're trying to get to, but kind of celebrating it as a destination and a place and a part of your journey offers different challenges.
Professor Bernard?
I mean, during my talk, I mentioned it briefly that in the early days of the elevator, we had this hat controversy if you leave the hat on or take it off, and also like Mr. Nichols said, the interior of the elevator cabin in the early days reminded of a living room rather, with the chandeliers and the sofas. So maybe the most consequent synthesis of these two categories has been made by a shoe producer in a big shoe company back in Czechoslovakia in the early 20th century, because, and this is a famous European elevator story, the founder of this company had his office in the elevator. Because he said, there I will meet my employees most of the time in a natural way. So he had this office in an elevator.
I'll just add as a brief anecdote, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in its Chinese galleries has a small elevator going from the second to the third floor. And in that elevator, there is one case of little Chinese porcelains you can look at. So as to make sure that the elevator journey is itself a place and not just a place between places. I'm going to go to a question from Yvonne, a topic for either or both speakers, the technology and the appeal of glass elevators. I'll ask Dr. Bernard first.
That was already the question.
Yeah, I mean, what is the appeal of glass elevators? I suppose be more for you than the technology, which might then go to Mr. Nichols, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the appeal of the glass elevator is in so far very interesting, as it opposes a lot of things which are normally typical for an elevator. When I talked before about the elevator as the dark spot, the dark narrow spot where intimacy meets anonymity, and which was dangerous for monarchs and all that, then you could say the glass elevator opposes to all these typical effects of the elevator. And when I was studying the topic, I was very surprised how old the glass elevator is, because I thought, that it maybe appears in the 1970s. Maybe you remember this movie Glass with Jacqueline Bisset in the early 80s, where she kisses her lover in a glass elevator. And I thought this was a very, very modern architecture, but it's very old. So the heydays of the glass elevator are in the pre-First World War German architecture. So Bruno Taut, a very famous architect around 1910, built a lot of glass elevators in Berlin. And it was kind of the, neue Sachlichkeit. I don't know how this era is called in English, maybe like new reductionism or so, like the architecture era in the 1910s, 20s. And so, yeah, I would say the glass elevator is about transparency. It's about visibility. It's about representability, if you will. And so it's a very untypical concept of the elevator.
Thank you. Mr. Nichols?
No, it's an interesting point, and I agree with Professor Bernard touched on something that I think is important to remember, is that glass elevators are older than we realize, and in some ways they're similar to the birdcage elevators that came before them. So in both cases, they kind of offer passengers two things, or I say people in the building two things: the ability to look out, so the person in the elevator can see. And we think of glass elevators sometimes as being the panoramic elevator to see the vista, to see the atrium of the hotel, or some tourist attraction perhaps. But also you can see in. So differently than having the technology kind of hidden in the core of the building, you often see glass elevators, and even in those early elevators, you can see both the people in the elevator as well as kind of the movement of the system. I'm reminded, I was doing a little bit of reading in preparation. I'm reminded that one of the first buildings that had, or the first building that had an elevator bank, the Boreal building in New York City, it didn't have a glass elevator, but it had kind of a mesh in the shaft wall so that the people could see the elevator moving back and forth. And I think that ability to see the elevator or to see out helps demystify some of the technology. So some of the fear that Professor Bernard mentioned, I think it's in this day and age when there's so much discussion about autonomous vehicles, some of us in the vertical transportation industry point out that we've had autonomous vertical transportation for decades.
It's funny, Mr. Nichols, because I was invited on a podcast of a developer of autonomous vehicles who read my book, and he was of the opinion that everything he needs for the development of autonomous driving he can find in the history of the elevator. So, yeah.
And I'd be fascinated to hear that podcast, because there are definitely clues in what we're doing. I mean, the hardest problem, as I understand it, in all of the computer vision and everything around autonomous vehicles is looking around at the environment. Elevators benefit hugely by the fact that we can control the environment and we can build the elevator shaft. I mean, elevators are interesting in the sense that half of it is constructed in the factory and then half of it is constructed in the building as you go up. But that interplay is important, and I mean, certainly there's a lot of technology in glass elevators to make them safe and make them fire resistant and make them available. So for example, the birdcage elevators I talked about, those are thought to not be very safe because you can stick your fingers through the cage, and that's a bad thing for many reasons. So the glass elevators are now as safe as any other elevator, but they do offer that interesting advantage to the passengers.
I mean, when I started my research on the very beginning, my first interest in elevators was that in novels and movies, because I'm originally a researcher in literature, that the appearance in novels and movies were always connected to things which have to be hidden. A secret affair in a screwball comedy, a murderer in a criminal story, a transvestite in comedies like Some Like It Hot. There's always an elevator involved. So in literature and cinema, the elevator comes to occasion when there's something secretive. And that's the reason why the glass elevator is interesting, because it opposes to all this tradition.
Yeah, and it as my family will attest to, it's tough watching movies with an elevator engineer because it's very rare to find an action movie that does not include at least one scene in an elevator. And much of the technology we see in movies around elevators is horribly wrong for one reason or another.
Right.
It's like being being from New York City and watching the movies, which are inevitably set in Toronto anyway. I have a question from Donald Hicks. This question for anyone. While building architecture was both a cause and consequence of the evolution of elevator technology, so too was the architecture of urban form itself. Would you agree that the elevator helped determine the value of land and locations, the emergence of central business districts, etc.? Has the possibility of vertical transportation helped promote new forms of horizontal development? Do you agree? And could you please elaborate?
Yeah, these are many questions in one. Maybe I can comment on one of them about the question if vertical architecture contributed to the value of land. I mean, of course, and it's interesting. I don't know, Mr. Nichols, if you also dealt with this, but if you consider the history of New York City, of Manhattan, then the invention of the elevator coincided with the problem that there was no space anymore in Manhattan. And as far as I remember, the stock exchange should, in the 1850s, should be removed to Brooklyn. And then the elevator architecture came in. So, of course, Manhattan is the genuine spot of elevator architecture. And I think it came at the right time, right? Because there was no space anymore. And if you think about value of land today and value of almost virtual or fictitious land, because it's in the air, you know, if you buy, I mean, Mr. Nichols has the Manhattan Skyline behind him. If you think about the new skyscrapers, the 100th floor, and you have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars for space, which is kind of fictitious because it's hundreds of meters up in the air, then it's very interesting how the elevator, in combination with steel architecture, created value in a part of the world, in the mere air, where no value would have been 100 years ago.
Yeah, no, I building on Professor Bernard's comments, I agree. It's so to me, it's another story of these parallel developments and innovation building off of itself. So I mean, to me, the debate of which came first, elevators or steel technology, and which pushed skyscrapers, while interesting, they evolved together. I think New York is an interesting example of you have that lack of space and you have to build up. New York, Manhattan, the island of Manhattan is a restricted space. You cannot grow out like you can in a city like Chicago or Paris or Berlin. But it's the combinations of other things. I think there's an interesting debate about why the skyscrapers were built in certain places in New York, and was it a result of planning and zoning and specific policy, or was it related to kind of the geology under the ground and kind of the development of the foundation technology? I think all of those things are related. And I think that story continues to today. So I think that there's a joke sometimes told in the elevator industry that building tall is not about economics, it's about egonomics. Because if you look at kind of the economics of and the extreme cost of building new buildings, there's a tipping point, and it's lower than you might think, that somewhere in kind of the 40 to 60 story range is where the economics of building a building kind of make the most sense, just from a building perspective, because anything taller than that, you need more mechanical systems, you need to lift everything higher. It's not just the elevator, it's the plumbing, the electricity, all of the different systems, both in construction and then kind of the multi-decade use of that building. So in some ways, that going tall and getting mega tall buildings is one solution, but it suggests other solutions where going horizontal, building clusters of buildings. Kind of the interesting thing to me is not just the development of multi-use buildings, but kind of multi-use complexes and how you get kind of neighborhoods into the city. So it's fascinating to me that a lot of the conversations in urban development and polycentric cities and these kinds of things, in many ways, are how do we go back to what may be almost the medieval village and the communities that our ancestors had, of how do you have all of those amenities in one place, and then how do you construct and arrange that in either a horizontal or a vertical paradigm.
And Dr. Bernard, did you want to add to that, or?
No, I think I was finished with my one answer.
I am going to go to the realm of science fiction and the future. Space elevators. One, are they actually elevators in any real sense of the word? And then, and I want to tie this in. To what extent is that vision inspired either culturally or technologically by the existing elevator? I mean, are we thinking about space elevators because we have an image of elevators in our head already culturally, and we're just sort of trying to apply it on a bigger scale?
That's a complicated question. I mean, I remember when I did the research on my book, I dealt with the mythology of the what's the term in English language, the sky ladder, or how do you say, in the Bible. Anyway, like
Jacob's ladder.
Pardon?
Jacob's ladder going to heaven.
Right. I think if you think about this is a very special vocabulary that I don't know very well in English, but the whole concept of God rising vertically to the sky and Jacob's ladder. So what I want to say is the notion of direct vertical transportation from Earth to heaven is a very old mythological concept, right? So I would say to try to answer your question, the ambition to build space elevators is maybe not so much inspired by current technology, but by very old spiritual and religious mythology.
I like Professor Bernard's answer. I think that I think you can find several philosophers and scientists who've been talking about, as long as we've been standing on Earth, we've been dreaming about going other places. The space elevator is one way to do that. To answer your question directly, yes, it's an elevator in the broadest sense of the term. So, I mean, we touched briefly on hydraulic elevators that push up and traction elevators that pull. But I mean, there's other types of elevators and elevating platforms. I mean, the elevators on an aircraft carrier that bring equipment up and down, one form of an elevator. The elevating platforms that help with accessibility in many places, those are a different technology. I think, to be more precise, I might call a space elevator an elevating platform, because I'm not familiar of any concepts that would have a counterweight and be similar to a traction elevator. But it's to me, it speaks to that dream to go beyond that Professor Bernard mentioned.
Thank you. I have a question. Is materials science still affecting the history of the elevator? That, if you've talked about, the limits of, steel cables and so on, Are we getting new steel, new glass, new polymers that are expanding the capacity of elevators?
So yeah, the short answer is yes. But in several different ways. So I mean, the suspension members, the ropes or the belts that we've talked about, are certainly important. So and that in and of itself has some interesting historical perspective. So for example, I mean, most people when they think of an elevator, they think of the steel cable. But many elevators now, at least in kind of the low rises that are actually flat belt. So the first flat belt electric elevator that I'm aware of was provided by Schindler in, I think it was 1892 or sort of the late 1890s, where they were using flat belt technology. But flat belts, where you kind of unroll the steel cable and put them in a jacket, don't really become popular until around the year 2000. And the reason is because by using a flat belt, you can shrink the propulsion and you can put the elevator inside the hoistway and eliminate the machine room. So that's one recent example in the last 25, 30 years of material. There's even more where, I mean, there are folks looking at carbon fiber and some of these other kinds of things. If you look at the interiors that Professor Bernard mentioned, I think if you look historically, interiors go from wood to metal to in some cases very ornate artistic things. But how do you incorporate newer materials, plastic fibers, kind of other polycarbonate and different materials, whether for noise and vibration, whether for lightweight, all of those things continue to happen. I think the elevator industry, like many other industries, is a good example of how do you borrow and learn from other industries and incorporate those inventions and innovations to solve the problems of weight, fire resistance, noise and vibration, et cetera.
Thank you. I have a historical cultural question now to go away from material science. Speech in elevators and speech codes, how do they emerge and how do they vary? And what I want to say is, it seems to me it's a great issue. Do you speak in an elevator? How do you speak? What is your tone of voice? Do you have the elevator meeting or do you have silence? Because it is such a compressed, intimate yet public environment. What are the speech codes that emerge from elevators in the first generations? How do they vary from place to place?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, it builds up to this problem of what I mentioned in my talk, this unique combination of intimacy and anonymity, right, in the elevator. So you meet people whom you might not know, but you meet them in an almost intimate constellation. And I don't know of speech codes, so I've never seen like a sticker in an elevator, please don't talk or so. So I think it's more something of mutual understanding. Yes. But there is one famous anthropologist, Irving Goffman, who has done some what he called proximity studies in the 1960s, where he put strangers in an elevator, and he always could show that they always stand in the same pattern. So if you ride an elevator the next time after our talk this afternoon, maybe you can confirm this study by yourself. If you walk in an empty elevator, you kind of you act like you want, very free. And when the second person come in, you always stay like this, like in two corners. And the third person stands in the third corner, the fourth person in the fourth, and the fifth has to go in the middle. And then there's something which a German sociologist called a big performance of non-acting. And I think that's a good description, because everybody knows this awkward situation in the elevator where you try to look at your fingernails and you're longing for something to read, you're longing for a certain display where you can put your view on, because it's so awkward. And I would, since I don't know, this has not come across in my research, because it's a wonderful question, codes of speech, but you have a lot of subtle codes of behavior, and these codes are always about non-behavior. So act as non-behavioral as it can get.
And Mr. Nichols, do you want to build on that, or?
No, building on it. So the interesting thing that I was thinking of is beyond the behavior that's of the people riding the elevator, you have an interesting notion of the elevator itself talking. And if you allow me to expand a little bit there, if you go back to that time when you had an elevator operator, it was a very personal interaction. The elevator operator might know who you were, they might know already where you're going. If they were attuned in a residence, they might be the one to say, hey, excuse me, Professor Bernard, it's raining outside, make sure you have your umbrella. And in many ways, a lot of the development and some of the innovations that are happening now are to bring some of that personalization back. And there's kind of an interesting history over the last, I would say, 70 years of the elevator itself talking. So certainly many of us are familiar with kind of the beeps and the boops, if you will, and the lanterns and the tones of an elevator coming and going. But what should the elevator be telling you? How should it be telling you? How much information does it or does it not share? Is an interesting question. In some ways, it goes back to that notion of it being an autonomous vehicle and a part of the system. But you both have the people talking or not talking, as Professor Bernard mentioned, and then you have the interaction of how can the elevator itself become part of the conversation?
Yeah, that's great, and it reminds me on the last chapter of my book, because when I studied the role of the elevator, let's say in Hollywood cinema, it came across to me a certain pattern. And if you want, you can try to study it yourself when you watch some films on Netflix or so. There's always this pattern in Hollywood movies when two persons are in an elevator on their own. The elevator gets stuck, and then they are in the stuck elevator, and then they start to have a very, very deep conversation about confessing the truth. That's always the case. And I think you could say that the elevator is a, how do you say in English, a secular, like in the church, and that you have to confess the truth. And I think this is as a result of the relationship of architecture, space, and the notion of truth. Because in church, since the Middle Ages, the secular,
the confessional, yeah,
the confessional has been like more and more closed. You know, like in the 13th, 14th century, when this system started in Catholic Church, it was just a chair. Then they built curtains around it, and then walls, and then it was the confessional as we know it. And so this was my closing hypothesis in the book, that the elevator is the confessional of our present times.
Yeah, it's in the thought that it spurs to me, Professor Bernard, is, I mean, so elevators are extremely safe. I mean, they're one of the safest forms of transportation in the world, yet many people are apprehensive of riding elevators. And I might actually propose, from what you just said, maybe they're not apprehensive about getting stuck in an elevator, but they're apprehensive of who they might get stuck in an elevator with.
And as we know, in reality, an elevator never gets stuck. It's just it's fiction. I read that some statistics that taking the stairs is 10,000 times more dangerous than taking the elevator. So it's a very safe means of transportation, but that's boring for Hollywood films.
Yes, elevators have many redundant safe means, and properly maintained elevators are one of the safest forms of transportation.
I will have one more vaguely science fictional question. Computerization thereof, is it being used to have, say, elevators in big office buildings learn where they should go and in what order to be more efficient, or is simply answering the button sufficient unto the day?
So the answer to like many of these questions is yes and yes. So I mean, the elevator dispatching is an art and a science to itself. So kind of, and elevators have been positioning themselves in the right place in the building to respond fastest for as long as they've existed. I mean, certainly that was done by the elevator operator prior to controls and software and computers taking on. And certainly there's a lot of advances as that era moves forward. So I think to me, when you look at the broad topic of computerization or digitization of the elevator, it's really happening in two areas. One is, how do you enhance passenger experience? How do you, and some of that may be getting people there faster or more convenient, but it also may be, how do I personalize the ride along the way? So if I have the ability to sense that it's Professor Bernard or Mr. Randall coming into the elevator, and I can tune the music in the elevator to the right person, that's an area of development and things that's coming forward. So the ability to personalize both to highlight the environment of the building as well as personalized for the riding public is certainly a possibility. And I think there's a whole nother area of development and future in terms of predictive, proactive maintenance and service. And I think you see the development of IoT, Internet of Things, both in the elevator industry and many other places as well.
And Professor Bernard, do you want to add to this in any way, or?
No, I think it was a great answer. Yeah. I mean, I think we are already almost at the end there, right? So no, it was I think
in which case, oh, thank you. I'm going to ask each of you for then a final minute, 30 seconds, a minute conclusion, final comment, and then I'll just do some household business for NAS and final comments here. Professor Bernard, you first.
Yeah, maybe it's a very interesting experience that in March 2023, in a 90 minutes talk on elevators, we haven't mentioned COVID. And this is, I think, a great thing, because it shows how fast we have recovered, because 2 years ago, I had to write every week one article about how the elevator is not usable anymore in times of the epidemics, right? And the narrowness of the elevator was one of the biggest problems in these 2 or 3 years. And so that's maybe one of the most interesting effects tonight or this afternoon, that we already have forgotten all that. And this is maybe nice that we are back in our daily life.
Thank you. Mr. Nichols.
No, and I first of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Professor Bernard, for the conversation. I think it's also telling that we still probably have more questions and more stories to tell, even after 90 minutes. I think many folks think of this as something that was settled technology, and there's certainly lots of active development and lots of active, interesting things to do in both how elevators interact with the world. Just touching on the COVID-19 pandemic for a moment, I was directly involved in research to understand kind of how elevators were relatively safe within kind of the context. So I think it's elevators and kind of the way we move through cities is central to our lives. And it's an interesting place to both explore the history and kind of understand how that can influence where we go forward.
Well, thank you both. I'm going to end with more thank yous to everybody, including the audience. I'll just do some of the household business first. First off, more questions, if you got them, send them to me, Randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. You want to watch this again? It'll be up within 24 hours on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. Encouraging anybody who enjoyed this, join the NAS, become a member, support fine webinars. Look at our website, www.nas.org, see what we do, not just webinars, but this is one of the fun things which is part of our remit. Future webinars. We have whole bunches and all sorts of series. I think the next one in this series is March 24th, Benjamin Franklin and his lightning and electricity discoveries, kites forsooth. So that's in for American inventions. We also have stuff like mismatch and the decline of academic standards. That's coming, I think that's next Tuesday. Also 2 p.m. Eastern. Anyway, look at our website. We've got all sorts of webinars coming up in all sorts of series. Do take a look at them. And I guess I will then go from there again to the thank yous. Thank you to our two panelists. Wonderful listening, wonderful getting the culture, the mechanics, the history, the future of the elevator from the two of you. Wonderful. Thank you to the audience. We do it for you. We can't do it without you. These are your questions which make the Q&A happen. We need you, and you've done wonderfully by us in this. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. It's been delightful. I love listening. I love learning. And this is a very, I think, a wonderful entry in our American Inventions webinar series. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Stephen.
Bye-bye.